As an actor, I have portrayed Theo, the little-known brother of artist Vincent van Gogh. Somehow, I related so strongly to the story of the two brothers that I became obsessed with Theo's struggle to defend Vincent and to prove that he was not insane. Most people, including many experts, believe that Vincent van Gogh was mad. His brother didn't, and I have evidence that he was right.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
This, for me, is a personal search. A search for a man who painted brilliant impressions of sunflowers and starry nights. He was called Madman by many, and in fact, he did cut off part of his own ear. But was he really mad? He was born twice, and he had a deep feeling for family. Yet, he considered himself a stranger on the earth. Vincent van Gogh. Today, 14 of his works are displayed here in the celebrated Louvre Museum in Paris. In a feverish 10-year period, though plagued by illness, he turned out 1,800 pieces of work, many of which sell for as much as $1 million each today. Clearly, Van Gogh belongs in the pantheon of the world's greatest artists. How could works of such beauty be the product of a deranged mind? Vincent van Gogh, Dutchman, painter, impressionist, lover of love, God, and art, took this route to the south of France after a year of painting and studying in Paris. As I followed his trail, I reviewed my research. From collections of his preliminary sketches, we know that he studied his art logically, precisely. He was well-read. He knew 5 languages. His work was not accidental. It was an act of choice and use of skills which he had worked hard and long to acquire. For me, something here rang a jarring note. How could this man work so diligently, skillfully? How could he write more than 500 beautiful letters to Theo, so sensitive and full of enlightened insight, if he were actually insane? Whatever Vincent's problem was, it began to appear here in the south of France. What I hoped to find was the cause. Was it the intense loneliness? Was it the burning southern sky? Was it the maddening Mistral wind, lack of proper food, or the feverish work itself? What caused the man to fall to the depths of illness and despair while his work soared to the heights of brilliance? My first stop in the town of Arles would be the corner where Vincent lived, in what became known as the Yellow House. The adjacent sidewalk cafe is still open for business. I stopped to absorb the atmosphere. The Yellow House had been destroyed during World War II. All that remains is Vincent's luminescent painting. Here, Vincent dreamed of starting a community of artists, and Paul Gauguin was invited to be its leader. Gauguin, eloquent, outspoken, and arrogant. He had deserted his wife and 5 children in favor of painting. To share his home, Vincent could not have picked a more unsuitable partner. But Vincent, thrilled by Gauguin's acceptance, painted masterpieces to decorate the walls. Gauguin arrived and flattered Vincent by painting his portrait. They worked together and they socialized together. But soon, more than anything, they argued. Vincent, always the straightforward, passionate seeker of truth. Gauguin, caustic, cool, baiting Vincent as a matador might taunt a bull. Eventually, Vincent wrote, "I think our friend Gauguin has become tired of our house, the little town of Arles, and especially me." Was it the agitation of the argument? Was it alcohol? Was it illness? What triggered the famous events which followed? According to Gauguin's version of the story, he took a walk into the night. He was being followed. It was Vincent with a razor. Gauguin later reported, "I stared him down with a look." What really happened, we will never know.
My soul breaketh with the longing that it hath, and that I say it all. Thou hast rebuked the proud, which
Then, Vincent performed the act most widely presented as evidence of his insanity. He went back to his room and severed half his ear. Later that night, he delivered a bizarre gift to a prostitute named Rachel at a local brothel and said, "Gardez cet objet précieusement." Guard this object carefully. It was the severed ear. Why? The answer may lie in a previous relationship with a prostitute named Christine. When Vincent met her, she had a child and was expecting another. Vincent felt he could save her from the streets. It was a noble effort, but a failure. The lady did not want to change her lifestyle. Was there for Vincent a connection between his past and the present? The hospital at Arles, where Vincent van Gogh was treated after he had slashed his ear. Why had he done it? And was he really mad? Why was he suffering such personal pain while his work was soaring? Here I hope to find some answers. I quickly recognized the garden of one of his famous paintings. And now, the first real clues began to emerge. In the hospital records, I found the diagnosis of his illness. The key word was a total surprise: epilepsy. Dr. Ray, his physician, diagnosed Vincent as epileptic, suffering from seizures, hallucinations. He was hearing voices which taunted him, terrified him. Vincent's biblical training had taught him, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. I wonder if Vincent was trying to silence an offending ear. The isolation chamber where Vincent was locked up during his stay at the hospital. This was his view of the world when he wrote, "Dear Theo, I write to you in full possession of my faculties, and not as a madman, but as the brother you know." A certain number of people addressed a petition to the mayor, describing me as a man not fit to be at liberty. The commissioner of police then gave the order to shut me up without my guilt being proved or even open to proof. I have done no harm to anyone. After his release, Vincent was embittered and deeply pained by the cruel actions of the people of Arles. He realized that he was ill, but felt that he deserved help rather than punishment. It became obvious that he would suffer periodic hallucinatory attacks, which terrified him. Vincent and his brother Theo decided that he should have constant medical supervision. He signed himself into the asylum at Saint-Remy. It was understood that he would be allowed to paint whenever he was well enough to do so. He wrote to his brother, "I think I have done well to come here. The idea of work as a duty is coming back very strong. I have 2 landscapes done, views among the hills. One is the country I see from the window of my bedroom, a boundary wall, and beyond it, the gray foliage of a few olive trees and the hills."
Though here there are some patients very seriously ill, the fear and horror of madness that I used to have has lessened a great deal. When I'm working in the garden, they all come to look. And I assure you, they have the discretion and the manners to leave me alone. More than I can say for the good people of the town of Arles.
A major newspaper article now praised Vincent as the leader of the Impressionists, and one of his canvases was sold for the equivalent of $80, his first sale. He was 36. No other painting would be sold in his lifetime. The quality and quantity of his work was enormous. He captured, enhanced, and enriched whatever he saw. He said, "I feel as if nature has spoken to me." The pattern of Vincent's life now was defined. The attacks were almost predictable, approximately every 3 months. They were followed by periods of recovery and feverish work. Hardly the pattern of a madman. And then again, the next attack. The voices, always the damnable voices that beleaguered his brain. In May 1890, after 2 years in the South, Vincent's loneliness and his longing to see his brother and the North again prompted a decision to leave Saint-Remy. Before following Vincent's trail to Auvers, I had one more important stop to make. The nature of Vincent's illness was now clear. But what about his mysticism? Why did he suspect that there was another side to existence? Why did he see death as a trip to a star? Perhaps at his birthplace, I would find some answers. Certainly, the family offered no clue. His father, a minister in the Reformed Church, both parents, straightforward, no nonsense, bound by tradition. No mysteries here. And yet, during his brief career as an evangelist among the miners in Belgium, Vincent preached that he was a stranger on the earth. Why? In Zundert, Holland, I made an amazing discovery. In the early 1850s, a strange ritual took place at this church every Sunday. Young Vincent van Gogh visits a grave which bears his own name. The grave is that of a brother who was stillborn. Both Vincents were born on exactly the same date, 1 year apart. He lived his entire childhood with a ghost that bore his name. Could this Sunday ritual have planted the seeds of his mysticism? In Auvers, a suburb of Paris, arrangements were made for him to live in a room over the Café Ravoux, now called the Café Van Gogh. He was placed under the care of a sympathetic doctor named Gachet. The current owner of the Gachet house, Madame Vandenbroek.
Vincent came earlier than expected and was terribly impatient. He came out here unannounced and came like a bombshell on the terrace and was standing there in the bright sunlight when he was discovered and ushered into the dining room. The doctor was called, and when the dining room shutters were slightly closed because of the strong sunshine, and Vincent, who wanted to see the view, threw them open and was standing there just drinking it all in, and the first sight the doctor had of his patient and friend was that one.
He was indeed impatient, and perhaps he had good reason. When he arrived in Auvers, he had 70 days to live. Is it possible that he knew that? In those 70 days, he turned out 100 pieces of work, as if he were in a race against time. On a Sunday morning, the 27th of July, 1890, Vincent, as usual, took his paint box, easel, and brushes and walked up this road to the nearby fields. He was also carrying a gun. He was about to make a decision. Regardless of our moral reaction to his act, it must be recognized as a deliberate choice. After lying unconscious all day in the hot sun, he managed to stagger back to the cafe. What occurred in the last hours of his life most clearly indicates that he was not mad, but obviously a man afflicted with a physical problem which drove him to a desperate act. His brother received the news the next day and came immediately.
When Theo stepped into this room, he expected to find his brother either unconscious or dead. He was shocked to find Vincent sitting up in his bed, calmly smoking his pipe. Vincent asked his brother not to cry. He said, "I did it for the good of everyone." Dr. Gachet said that Vincent's wound wasn't really that serious, and Vincent had a strong constitution. His chances of recovery were good. But Vincent was very stubborn about it. It seemed as though he was determined to succeed in his own death. He said, "I've been a failure at so many things in my lifetime. I hope I haven't failed at this as well." Theo held his hands, and they talked late into the night. And then Theo said, "I felt his hands weaken, and his voice grew fainter. I sat on the bed. I cradled him in my arms. I kissed his face, and he looked up at me, and he said, 'Theo, I wish I could die like this.' And then," said Theo, "he closed his eyes, and I felt his heart stop. I held him close. I didn't want to let him go. I felt his soul lingering near me for those next few moments, and then something went out of me, and he was gone.
Vincent's brother Theo, his only lifelong friend and support, went into a physical and emotional decline, and 6 months later joined his brother in death.
With the Mistral wind, the heat of the sun, his illness, it's amazing that Vincent van Gogh accomplished as much as he did. While it is interesting and worthwhile to investigate the man, the power and the magnificence of his work are awesome. Today, the controversy about Vincent van Gogh continues. He was a very complicated man. He was sometimes difficult, sometimes stubborn, mystical, loving, self-destructive, and always passionate. I set out looking for answers to a set of intellectual questions. Some of those questions have been answered, some still remain mysteries. But I found something that was, in a sense, beyond the search, and I think even more important. In my efforts to understand the man, I found a new and even deeper appreciation for the beauty that he gave us.
From Rome to Damascus, from Florence to Samaria, holy places are reserved for the scattered remains of a body believed to be John the Baptist. These fragments have been worshipped for centuries. Far from Europe's civilized centers, from a desert populated mostly by nomads, comes a discovery which may shake the Church of Rome. A remote monastery of the Coptic Church holds a mysterious link to John the Baptist. Its monks still practice ceremonies which date back to the very time of St. John. Here, never before photographed, is the underground vault which concealed an amazing burial. Could isolated monks have found the real bones of John the Baptist and cast doubt on the claims of Rome?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Sealed by the Vatican in a gold and silver case, this relic is believed to be the actual mummified head of John the Baptist.
In Catholic tradition, every altar must contain a relic. Relic has a specific meaning, part of the body of a saint. From the smallest piece of bone to bottles of blood, bits of clothing, limbs, or an entire body, relics have always performed an important function. Before a person can be declared a saint, church officials must determine if his or her relics have inspired a miracle.
This small fragment, about 1 inch square, is believed to be part of the jawbone of John the Baptist. Many relics of John are displayed in Florence. Teaching there is an American professor of art and theology, Michael Petruccioni.
Now, when we walk in as foreigners to a European church and see the head, the arm, the leg of a saint, it disgusts us, but we forget that the teachings of Christianity are that the body is not important after life, that dust to dust.
Many display cases are works of fine art. This reliquary contains what may be John's right index finger.
What is the value of a relic to a traditional Christian? There's no value of the relic in itself. The teachings of the church are that one looks at a relic not in veneration of the piece of bone, piece of flesh, or article of clothing, but to remember through the example that comes to one's mind, for example, with St. John, of his great dedication to Christ, his careful following of the new order as established by Christ, that the Christian then has a good example. To remember, I must be like St. John, and that's why that relic is there.
Throughout Europe, magnificent cathedrals were constructed to house these remains. Statues of John stand in almost every public square. A mystery in his own time, John was an even greater enigma after his bloody execution. It's rarely mentioned that John the Baptist and Jesus were second cousins. According to the New Testament, there is a fascinating parallel in their births. Mary, young and virginal, was told by an angel she would bear a child, Jesus. Mary's cousin Elizabeth, old and barren, had been told by the same angel she would have a child, John. Christians believe John was the last prophet of the old order and Jesus the first of the new. As a young man, John went to live as a hermit, dressed like the old prophet Elijah in animal skins. The son of a high Judaic priest, he could have enjoyed a life of wealth and prestige. His food was locusts. It's not common knowledge, but 5 varieties of locust are kosher, and 2 are non-kosher. A better source of protein than beef, locusts are also free of disease and parasites. For a desert dessert, John ate wild honey. Rumors spread about this strange, wild man. People asked, "Are you the prophet Elijah who promised to come back from the dead? Are you the Messiah?" John replied, "I am a voice crying in the wilderness, preparing a way for the Lord, making straight in the desert a highway for our God."
There have been a number of speculations as to why John may have gone into the wilderness. Perhaps the most romantic one tells of his rejection as a lover by Salome and him going into the wilderness to get over his thwarted love.
Gerald LaRue is professor of religion at the University of Southern California.
Another idea came when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was suggested that perhaps John had been a member of this Essene or Dead Sea community and had left and had gone into the wilderness to proclaim the kingdom of God on his own. But again, there is no definite evidence of this, no roster of membership, and no concrete way to link John to this community. There is a better explanation, and it fits into the Jewish tradition. From time immemorial, Jewish holy men had gone into the desert to find the way of God. We have the example of Moses and Elijah, and there's no reason why we can't speculate that John, following in that tradition, went out into desert places, not only to find God, but to proclaim the way of God.
John began to preach the coming of the end of the world. He expected the prophecy of Isaiah would soon be fulfilled, that every valley shall be raised up and every mountain leveled. John performed ritual bathing as a sign of repentance. This rite came to be called baptism, and John was named the Baptist. Among the thousands who flocked to the River Jordan, John's younger cousin, an unknown carpenter, Jesus of Nazareth. John said Jesus was the promised Messiah, and the Christian religion began. A few months later, John denounced King Herod for the sin of wife swapping, and John was arrested and dragged before the king. Surprisingly, King Herod listened to John's preaching. The queen, Herodias, however, had no intention of losing her influence to a desert prophet. Using her daughter Salome, the queen tricked Herod into promising her anything, and she demanded John's head on a plate. As Christianity spread throughout the world, John was revered as the first Christian martyr. A search for his remains began in the early centuries of the new era and may have just ended in a remote Egyptian monastery. Is it possible that the remains of John the Baptist were smuggled for safekeeping somewhere into the Egyptian desert? The Sahara has been called a land without time. To those who live here, the first century is yesterday. Near an oasis called Wadi el Natrun, monks of the Coptic or Egyptian Orthodox Church still follow a tradition which began with John the Baptist. Each of the monks at one time in his life retreats alone into the desert. The new hermit may not see another human for years. As strange as this life may seem, many of the monks claim it gives a feeling of limitless freedom. For millennia, the oasis has been a gathering place for holy men. Near broken tiles and ruins from the dim past, the Coptic Church built the monastery of Saint Macarius in 360 AD. Every day of the year, the monks of Saint Macarius follow the demanding discipline which regulates their lives, arising at 4 a.m. and praying until dawn. Father Jacobus El Macari came here in 1969. Before taking monastic vows, he was a professional architect and was therefore assigned to supervise maintenance on the monastery. What was to become a most unusual detective story began with routine renovation.
Because all the church was not sufficient for the new increasing number of the monks, they began excavating a debris of about 1 meter height. We began digging because we must build a strong foundation for the new constructions.
The grounds had to be enlarged and cleared of tons of rubble. Several times since the 4th century, the monastery had been sacked by marauding tribes, then leveled by an earthquake. Buried in the debris, hundreds of old columns, some still showing intriguing fragments of names. 16 centuries, however, had eroded most of the information. One source of information had not decayed over the years: oral history. In this secluded monastery, the practice of memorized verbal history has strong roots. Father Jacobus heard the older monks reciting a story which had been told and retold for 80 generations. According to this account, the bones of John the Baptist had been brought to this monastery and hidden somewhere on the grounds. Until this decade, however, no one had tried to find them. Jacobus began sifting through old Coptic texts to see if other accounts would corroborate the oral tradition. According to several independent sources, the bones of John had been smuggled out of the Holy Land to Alexandria, where for a time they were safe from desecration. Jacobus read that in the 10th century, the bones were secretly moved again to the monastery of St. Macarius. He searched the books for mention of a specific hiding place. None was written down. Could the monks have been walking over the remains of St. John somewhere on the grounds? Then, a clue. Most Coptic churches have small satellite rooms called sanctuaries for celebration of Mass. These sanctuaries are named for various saints, and Coptic tradition regarding their placement is normally very strict.
In any church, if you wish to build or to consecrate a sanctuary for St. John the Baptist, it must be to the south of the main sanctuary. But here in the church of St. Macarius, you see the opposite. The sanctuary of St. John the Baptist is to the left side, to the north. Why?
In the dim past of the monastery, someone had broken the ironclad Coptic tradition and built this sanctuary of St. John to the north. As the restoration approached this area, Jacobus could sense something special might be uncovered. Perhaps the actual remains of St. John? The monks realized their search was treading on fragile glass. Since the irreparable split between Catholic and Eastern Christianity 900 years ago, much blood has been spilled over far less important relics. They knew the Eastern Church would hesitate to challenge Rome's claim of the true remains of St. John. If the bones were here, maybe it was best to let them lie in an unmarked, unknown grave. Jacobus ultimately decided to trust in God and seek the truth, regardless of political consequences. Older monks had hinted at a special link between a small column in the unique North Sanctuary and John the Baptist. Then, another custom peculiar to this monastery. It had always been a tradition to offer incense to St. John near the base of that same column. Finally, excavation work began in this area. It may be only coincidence, but the monks emphasize that what happened next took place during the most holy season of Lent, during a period of intense fasting and prayer.
Eventually, it happened that when we began the removal, we found a wooden box.
The casket, which they removed and respectfully covered, held the remains of an 18th century patriarch. Under the casket, however, was a much more startling find. In an older layer of dirt, they uncovered a burial vault, and in the vault, skeletons, placed according to very old custom in bare earth with the head towards the west.
There's no way of proving that bones belong to any particular individual. I suppose we could carbon date the bones, and that would tell us the period they came from and would perhaps prove that they were not John the Baptist bones if they came from a different period. But even if they proved to be from the John the Baptist period, there'd be no way of identifying them precisely as the bones of John. I don't think the importance of the bones lies in whether or not we can prove precisely that they belong to John. They may not. What is important is what these bones as a symbol mean for believers. Here is a place of pilgrimage, here is a place of renewal of self, here is a place of identity with the past. And when people come here, they don't worry about whether scientists can prove these are John's bones. They are concerned with their faith and what this does to them.
This is the first film ever taken of the cleared vault, which has been preserved as evidence of the discovery. A modern reliquary was carved to house the bones. They are now wrapped in a special ritual cloth, which is never unrolled and covered, according to Coptic tradition, with a handful of dust. After the bones were found, the Coptic Pope made a special journey from Cairo to study the question. He advised the monks, for the time being, not to formally announce their discovery. Jacobus and his brothers obeyed. They have avoided seeking any publicity. Until this In Search Of program, no substantial film report has been made about the monastery's discovery. Is this the final resting place of the wandering prophet of the desert, John the Baptist? If so, one small band of monks have dropped a stone into the well of history, and waves will inevitably spread from this monastery beyond the borders of Egypt to the Holy Land, Rome, and the entire world. Pilgrims from around the world now visit the monastery of St. Macarius. Groups travel to this isolated religious outpost to worship what they deeply believe are the relics of John the Baptist.
When you visit the church and when you come to the relics themselves, you feel by a mystical element that there is something spiritual in the matter. When you come to the coffin themselves, you shall find it is impossible for you not to believe. How? It is not a matter of the mind, but it is a matter of the heart and the faith.
When a major airliner crashes, the tragedy is overwhelming, the destruction sudden and complete. In the spring of 1979, a New York woman has a series of dreams of an airliner disaster in the Midwest. 2 months later, a Cincinnati man dreams of a large jet in peril. It crashes and explodes. The dream repeats 10 nights in a row, and no matter what he does, it will not leave him alone. Were these dreams just nightmares, or will they prove to be prophecy?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
In the aftermath of a major air disaster, federal and state investigators sort through the debris looking for answers that might prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. Recent findings have revealed that a strange phenomenon often precedes these catastrophes. Psychic researcher and author Alan Vaughan believes a warning system that could avert these tragedies may be locked within our own minds. Some may disbelieve, but Vaughan's own strange experience perhaps indicates the possibility. A gifted psychic tested at the Maimonides Medical Center in New York, Vaughan meditated in 1969 about the upcoming Apollo 12 moonshot.
I got the impression that there is a grave danger for this flight. Unless something in the fuel system or electrical system is corrected, there will be an explosion which could kill the astronauts. I saw an image of Neil Armstrong's footprint on the moon, but there was a big X crossing it out. So I thought, no, they will not reach the moon.
Apollo 12 did experience problems at takeoff as the rocket was struck by lightning, but for the most part, there were no mishaps. Vaughan's premonition was wrong. 4 months later, April 1970, Apollo 13 is launched for the moon. Just as the capsule leaves Earth's orbit, a muffled explosion rocks the spacecraft.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please.
The astronauts inspect their disabled craft, and soon the problem is diagnosed. A fuel cell has exploded and cut off most of the capsule's electricity. The primary mission has been aborted. Did Apollo 13 fulfill Vaughan's premonition for Apollo 12? Skeptics would say no. Believers, however, hold that his Apollo 12 premonitions fit Apollo 13. Most of us think of extrasensory perception as an experience happening to others. Yet ESP can occur every night in our most common altered state of consciousness, sleep. Scientists are studying sleep in the laboratory, hoping to find evidence of ESP in dreams. At the Maimonides Medical Center in New York, Dr. Montague Ullman and his colleagues conducted a group of experiments that made research history. For 6 years, more than 100 subjects would come in at night to be studied as they slept. Their physical state would be recorded so that the scientists could monitor their brain waves and determine when they were dreaming. Could dreamers dream about the future, demonstrating precognition of an event that was yet to happen?
In the design of a precognitive experiment, the special waking event that the dreamer is to dream about does not exist. It hasn't been created. No one knows about it or what it's going to be.
Each night, the subject is asked to dream about a series of slides he will be shown the following day. these slides will be his target. His dreams are charted, and he will be awakened after each one.
I was dreaming of the color blue. It's very prominent, and it's birds and like the sky.
In the morning, he is interviewed to capture any last impressions before the dream reports are sent away to independent analysts.
Terry, what is your overall impression of this dream?
Well, I have the feeling that my next target will be concerned with birds.
Later that day, another experimenter who knows nothing about the subject's dreams selects a slideshow at random. If the topic of the show corresponds to his dream, the target will be hit.
Where our hypothesis was that precognitive dreaming could occur, the results of the judge's matching of dreams and target events was such that the likelihood of getting that result on a chance basis alone was less than 1 in 1,000.
This case, plus many others, suggests that precognition can occur in our dreams. However, precognition isn't limited to the laboratory. How many of us are glimpsing the future in our ordinary dreams and nightmares? Perhaps these dreams can be used to save hundreds of lives. Robert Nelson is searching for someone, maybe that 1 in 1,000, who can foresee the future and help prevent disasters. Nelson founded the Central Premonitions Registry. He regularly receives letters from people who feel they have had a preview of an important upcoming event. His files contain many intriguing correlations between news items and these predictions. What would happen if he received several warnings of a major air crash?
We would certainly draw up a letter to the heads of the airlines and also to the FAA pointing out that we have received careful and detailed predictions relating to what could be a disaster. And we would send this to the involved airline, plus we would probably send it to the other airlines too in case it was a miss on the airline, plus to the FAA. We would make sure that this information was disseminated.
Every day, Nelson searches his mail for messages of the future. But so far, no individual dream message has provided enough information to prevent a disaster. In 1978, Shawn Robbins had not heard of the Central Premonitions Registry. If she had, she might have reported this dream. Shawn recreates what happened that night.
It was Sunday night, and in September I had a dream that was different than my usual dream. I saw a plane in the sky. It was going to a destination. The destination was California. I had the feeling that a disaster was about to happen and would be the United States' worst in history. I also felt that this dream had a meaning to it, meaning it was imminent. The disaster was about to happen. I woke up. I had a radio show the next morning.
As a personal counselor who feels she has a heightened sense of ESP, Shawn is often interviewed on the subject. The morning after her dream, she was featured by Buddy Dean on KOTN in Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
We were on the air, and she said, I have had a dream, or words to that effect, that there is going to be a major air disaster. She emphasized major air disaster. Well, I didn't think a lot about it at that time, but about 3 hours later, I was driving in my automobile with the car radio on, and I heard our news director announcing a major air disaster in San Diego.
Less than 24 hours after Shawn's dream, a jet airliner collided with a private plane over San Diego, California. All 144 aboard perished. America's worst air disaster to that date.
Our telephone at the radio stations completely went insane because, of course, everybody's reaction was, did I hear that correctly? I heard the interview this morning. Did I hear that news? We had calls all day long. It turned the town upside down. There was really an amazing prediction there.
Concerns women.
Although in the past, Shawn has told others of premonitions of airline disasters that did occur, this was the first verified case. Less than 5 months after the San Diego crash, Sean began having dreams of another impending air disaster. Would she or other dreamers perceive enough information to prevent it? And even if they did, would anyone listen? In March 1979, Sean Robbins dreamed of another major plane crash. She sensed this event was still weeks or months away, but approaching with a terrible certainty. On March 12th, she told her premonition to John Erling, whose morning talk show is broadcast on KRMG in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Of 72.
And halfway through our conversation, as I started talking about previous airline crashes that had been predicted by her, she said, as a matter of fact, John, she said, I had a dream last night about a major airline crash that would happen in the Midwest. At that time, she gave me numbers, which could have been the flight number and tail numbers, as I recall, and said, but it was by a major airlines. Off the air, she gave me the name of the airlines.
And I gave a destination. I felt California would be important, as well as the Midwest, but I did not know at the time the interconnecting facts.
In the following weeks, Sean tried to escape the fear that was becoming a constant part of her life.
But you can't forget plane crash dreams. They don't let you forget. They come back, and they come back without warning. It's as if they want the story to be told. They have a mind of their own.
Sean continued to dream specific details about the disaster she felt was coming. On April 26th, she reported these to Ed Hartley on WKBX in Savannah, Georgia.
Any idea on how many people may be involved?
Well, the prediction that Sean made was that there was going to be a crash of a jumbo jet in the Midwest. Now, she saw the Midwest. She didn't see exactly where the crash would be. She did say later on in the conversation that California would enter into that, and she suspected that that was the destination of the airplane.
Sean said she sensed the crash was now less than a month away. As the dreams became increasingly terrifying, she dreaded falling asleep for fear of what she'd experience.
I become both now a passenger and a spectator aboard that aircraft. After the plane has crashed and everyone on board has died, and I walked away as the spectator, the living one, I wake up with a start. It's almost as if my heart is in my mouth. I said, why did I have the dream? Why didn't everyone else dream the same thing? Why was it me?
Was Sean becoming obsessed with plane crashes? Was she having a flashback to her previous dream prediction? Or was there something more to this new dream? One thing is certain, Sean was not alone. For David Booth of Cincinnati, a nightmare was just beginning. Before May 1979, David had led an average life, managing a rent-a-car office and raising a family. He never had psychic-type dreams before. But one morning, he was jarred awake by the shattering vision of an airliner crash.
On the morning of May 16th, I had a dream. I'm looking out to my right over a field, and there's a tree line diagonally down like that. And I look up in the air, and there's this great big jet, and it wasn't making the noise that it should. It wasn't a feeling of impending doom or that it was going to crash or anything. It just wasn't making the sound that it should. It starts to turn with the wing going up in the air, and it just goes on its back and then goes straight down into the ground, and it explodes. As the sound of the explosion would start to die out, that's when I would wake up. It was very, very scary. Trying to describe some of the emotions that I felt, I mean, how can you describe sorrow?
David was unable to understand his frightening dream. All that day, he tried to forget it by losing himself in his work. For the moment, he shared his experience with no one. That night, he went to bed exhausted, hoping his sleep would be undisturbed.
The second night that I had the dream, was a very weird experience. When I woke up, I had been crying. The main feeling that I had was urgency, as if I was being compelled to do something, to act fast.
As the week progressed and the dream repeated every night, David found it harder to ignore. Still, he kept it to himself. Tuesday, May 22nd, David had the dream for the 7th night in a row. He began to feel he would have no peace until he took action.
Starts to bank off and just rolls on its back and down it goes. And the same explosion. Nothing.
David telephoned the Cincinnati office of the Federal Aviation Administration and spoke to facilities manager Paul Williams.
The first thing David described to me was the type aircraft he thought it was. First of all, he identified it as an American Airlines plane. He described it as a big plane with an engine on the tail. Now, I asked him if he knew specifically what type aircraft it was, but David didn't know one type aircraft from another.
Williams asked David to search the dream for more specific information. But each night it came back frustratingly the same. All that week, they spent hours reviewing every detail.
My initial reaction to his description of the aircraft was that it was a Boeing 727. However, the engine on a Boeing 727 is in the tail, and the engine on a DC-10 is on the tail. A more accurate description of what he told me would be a DC-10 or a plane similar to that, because he described the plane as having an engine on the tail.
On Friday morning, May 25th, the start of the Memorial Day weekend, David had the dream for the 10th time. But this time, it left an unexpected impression. The feelings had not changed, but David said he somehow knew he would never have the dream again.
I went to the office, and I could not do anything. I think I must have just went through that whole day in a daze. Very much upset. Oh, I mean, I was, at one point in the afternoon, I thought I was on the verge of a nervous collapse. I took off work early. I had to. There was no other choice. I couldn't function there.
It was 4 o'clock. 3 o'clock at Chicago's O'Hare Airport.
Flight 191, cleared for takeoff. 191, roger, here we go.
270 people were aboard Flight 191, a DC-10 bound for Los Angeles. Was this the flight David and Sean had seen? Sean had seen an American Airlines jet bound for California involved in a Midwest crash. David identified the same airline and saw trouble for a large jet with an engine on its tail.
And I look up in the air, and there's this great big jet, and it just wasn't making the sound that it should. It starts to turn with the wing going up in the air, and then goes straight down into the ground, and it explodes.
One of the plane's engines had broken away during takeoff. At 500 feet, the plane began dropping. Eyewitnesses reported the other wing engine shut off. There was silence in the air. It was the worst air disaster in U.S. history. All those aboard died.
When I heard that an aircraft had crashed in Chicago, it was as if I knew what had happened. All of the other events that I've learned that happened in Chicago describe after the fact what David Booth described to me before the fact.
News of the disaster had not yet reached David and his family.
I came home, and we ate dinner, and we sat down to watch television, and a news break came on. I can't even find the words to describe how I felt. I called Paul Williams, and I think emotionally I just fell apart.
David appeared to me to blame himself for not being able to get enough information to prevent this accident from happening. He seemed to feel that if he could have grasped just a little bit more information, that he would have been able to prevent that accident. It seemed that he felt he was being singled out as the only person in the whole world that message was being given to. I tried to tell him that he couldn't blame himself for it, that he had done all that he possibly could.
We did try to do something. We made an attempt, even though we failed. If there had just been somebody that we could have talked to that understood these, then maybe in some way it couldn't have been prevented. I don't know. I feel that way. I feel that way very much.
Since his premonition about Apollo 12, Alan Vaughn has started dream workshops. At the New Ways of Consciousness Foundation in San Francisco, he helps people learn about the inner world of their minds and suggests techniques for coping with frightening dreams of the future.
Instead of being frightened by them, learn to talk to them and understand them. And then after a while, your dreams will give you images that can really be helpful. So you can turn a frightening situation where the dreams terrify you into a situation where the dreams bring gold.
Robert Nelson continues his search for dreams of the future. If you have a premonition, write to the Central Premonitions Registry, Box 482, Times Square Station, New York, New York, 10036. The banking institutions in the United States have a nagging problem. More than $20 billion in unclaimed monies. The birth of America gave rise to a new and revolutionary idea that a man, no matter his social class, could determine his future, make his fortune, and build a new life. The opening up of the West encouraged the belief that every man controlled his own destiny. Millions of dollars were made on the whims of chance, whether they were gamblers or miners, peddlers or farmers. Some of those fortunes became forgotten after their owners died in obscurity, never leaving a will. Of all the stories of money won and then forgotten, one stands apart from the rest. In the San Francisco vaults of Wells Fargo Bank lies what is purportedly the largest unclaimed stock certificate in the world. Its worth is estimated at $3.2 million. Who stands to inherit this fortune?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
San Francisco marks the start of the search for the heir to the $3.2 million. A great number of domestic as well as overseas financial institutions have chosen to place their headquarters here. Fortunes are spent sorting the thousands of documents that detail financial exchanges generated here. It was in the process of examining some of these records and setting up new files that Wells Fargo Bank accidentally discovered Stock Certificate 390.
The certificate epitomizes the $20 billion unclaimed in the United States today. Everyone watching this program might have had an aunt, uncle, or perhaps a great-great-grandparent who left money in an account, property, or stock that is forgotten. How would you like to inherit the $3.2 million in the Texas Pacific Land Certificate? In search of, set out to find the rightful heir. We began making a checklist of the leads that we had. First, we knew that Texas Pacific Land Trust Company had issued the certificate in 1888. Second, we knew that a New York lending firm, Blake Brothers, was involved. Third, the name Delamar was associated with the stock. How or why, we weren't sure.
The first name on the list of leads we had gathered from San Francisco research was Texas Pacific Land Trust. We traveled to Dallas, home of that corporation, in hope of learning more about the certificate. The vice president of the trust, Jim McCall, gave us our first solid bits of information.
Certificate 390 was one of the original certificates issued by the trust. It comprised 100 shares.
The certificate had originally been issued for shares of stock in T&P Railroad, which subsequently became Texas Pacific. The shares of stock represented parcels of land the railroad had received from the state of Texas in return for building a rail line from Texarkana to El Paso. Texas Pacific stock had split numerous times, and coupled with the trust's association with Texaco Oil, every original company share became worth incredible sums. Certificate 390 had become increasingly valuable because on much of the cattle grazing land it represented, oil had been discovered.
In 1954, the trust ran ads all over the country trying to find the unknown heir. I have this set of files here which represents correspondence, claimants, letters we have received from various people who think they may own it.
Texas Pacific found no one who could prove ownership. They did have records, however, that the New York lending firm, Blake Brothers, had originally purchased Certificate 390 and 4 others in 1888. All the certificates except 390 were recorded as being sold to other individuals. Only 390 had been lost. Some theorize that the mistake occurred because business records were not carefully kept before 1924, when the Securities and Exchange Commission demanded otherwise. There were other reports that possibly the certificate and any record of it were destroyed in a fire at Blake Brothers in the 1920s. The next stop, obviously, was New York and Blake Brothers. While checking business records in New York City, we discovered that the old Blake Brothers had liquidated all of their assets sometime in the mid-1950s and no longer existed. There was even an indication that Blake Brothers had begun an investigation into the whereabouts of Certificate 390. An attorney who represented Texas Pacific, Frederick Shea, explains.
They began a thorough search among their records and so forth to ascertain anything they could about why this certificate had originally been registered in their name and what had happened to it. And it turned out eventually that they couldn't find anything on it. So they came to the conclusion that since no one had claimed ownership of this certificate, which was then worth about $2 million, over all these years, and it was registered in their name, and there was no contrary evidence that they were entitled to it.
In 1952, Blake Brothers instituted a lawsuit in the New York Supreme Court, here recreated, to prove that they and they alone owned the certificate. Their case was consistently hindered by incomplete or inaccurate records. The case reached the turning point when their star witness, under oath, and who had been with the company since the late 1890s, could not remember details of transactions involving the certificate or of Texas Pacific Land Trust. It seemed that Blake Brothers could not prove ownership either. Then who was the real owner of the certificate? That left only one more lead on our checklist: the name DeLamar. New York's public library houses one of the best genealogical sections in the world. Nearly any name can be traced here. DeLamar was an unusual name, so we were hopeful of finding at least some information. Searcher Barbara Wager found something. There was a DeLamar, a Captain Joseph Raphael DeLamar, a prominent and wealthy New York citizen at the turn of the century who had emigrated from Holland. In the New York Times, we learned that upon his death in 1918, he had bequeathed great sums to medical schools, nieces and nephews, and to his only child, Alice. In that year, Alice DeLamar was still in her late teens, which meant that she could still be alive today to claim her fortune. In the process of researching the DeLamar name, we came across what might be another branch in the genealogical tree. A DeLamar family was living today in Atlanta. We had two choices. Since we had no record of DeLamar's daughter, we decided to follow up our lead in Georgia.
We have been able to trace our descendants back to around 1692.
Mr. and Mrs. Dean DeLamar had compiled a family genealogy, trying to discover if they could prove any relationship to Joseph Raphael DeLamar. In 1685, Louis XIV issued an edict expelling the DeLamar family, along with other Huguenots or non-Catholic Frenchmen, from France. In the process of fleeing to Holland or England, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered.
On the premise that the Huguenots either went through London or England and Holland, in that Joseph Raphael was in Holland, it would, I would think, would be a good connection that the DeLamars in America before Joseph were related to those in Holland. So I don't think there's any question that we can tie into Joseph Raphael.
To date, this link has not been confirmed. Then, an intriguing fact. Mr. DeLamar recalled discovering a silver boomtown in Idaho, which bore the family name, DeLamar. He wondered if there was a connection. We knew Captain DeLamar had various mining interests. Could the captain have owned the town? We headed west toward the Idaho, Oregon, Colorado borders, where the tiny town of DeLamar was located. We arrived in DeLamar to find it a ghost town. The old silver mine shaft was in ruins. The main street was only a shadow of what it had been. Most of the buildings, which had been hastily constructed, had fallen into complete disrepair. Their inhabitants, including DeLamar, had died or moved elsewhere. Nothing in the decaying ghost town gave us any further knowledge concerning the whereabouts of the captain or his daughter. The traditional records, marriage certificates, land deeds, wills on public file, were not helpful. We wanted to try one more possibility before leaving Idaho. Silver City, a sister town to DeLamar, was in the process of being restored. It was possible that someone there would have more knowledge of Captain DeLamar. Vivian Gotch is the curator of the Owyhee County Museum. She recalled a story that DeLamar left Idaho as the result of a broken romance.
He did not marry until he left here. He married in New York.
as I understand it, he did have a love in Silver City, and this might have been part of the reason why he left the area and never came back. But Captain Delamar, as far as I know, just had the one daughter.
Our only choice was to return to New York, where Delamar had perhaps married, and where his daughter had probably been born. One slim lead took us to Long Island. A newspaper article mentioned that in Glen Cove, Captain Delamar had built an estate called Pembroke for his daughter. We went to Robert Coles, the local Glen Cove historian, and asked him about his knowledge of the Delamar family or of Pembroke.
The beginning of the latter half of the 19th century, many people of wealth moved out here from New York and established homes, not homes similar to the early settlers. They were very simple, but they established mansions. And then a little after that, the yachting craze came in.
Mr. Coles remembered a Delamar family had once lived in the area, but did not know if any members still remained. Was it possible that Delamar, a former sea captain, built his mansion facing the sea?
I know that there were wealthy estates here. There was an estate that was known as Pembroke.
Mr. Coles agreed to guide in search of cameras to an area where many old Glen Cove estates had been built. Although our society is referenced and cross-referenced in computerized records, we found no note of Alice Delamar. The only lead we had was Mr. Coles, who knew the area. We had to rely on his memory to break the mystery of the missing heir. We did find an area that had once been called Pembroke. It was ironic that although we were searching for a person, we were reduced to looking for a landmark. When we arrived at the location, we found it overgrown, thick with weeds, poison ivy, and twisting, reedy vines.
Oh, my.
Deep within the overgrown area, we spotted remnants of a structure. It was, according to Mr. Cole's best estimates, Pembroke.
Oh, my.
Apparently, the mansion had been destroyed by fire. Virtually nothing was left. No personal effects, no papers had survived either the fire or the scavengers who surely followed.
Goodness. Never expected to find it.
There was not the tiniest scrap of evidence as to what had happened to the Delamars and where they might have gone. All we knew for sure was that Alice Delamar, the daughter of Joseph Raphael Delamar, once existed. Toward the end of World War I, she devoted a certain amount of her time to Red Cross service. Then, seemingly, she had disappeared from sight. Some say she moved to Paris for a brief period. No one was sure. Where had Alice gone? Was she still alive? If so, was it possible that she didn't know about the certificate in San Francisco? Would Alice Delamar ever claim what was rightfully hers? The affairs of New York high society at the turn of the century were well documented. Life consisted of a series of lavish parties at elaborate Park Avenue residences. The boredom was broken only by predictable trips to Europe. We reasoned that since Alice Delamar had received $10 million upon her father's death, her actions might also have been documented in publications devoted to the life of the wealthy. In one of the shadowy corners of the New York Public Library's main reading room, we began tracking Alice Delamar in the New York Social Registry. We learned that Alice had spent some time at this Madison Avenue apartment belonging to her father, and which was located next to the Henry Morgan residence. Later, she ensconced herself at this posh Park Avenue apartment house. At other times, she chose to live in West Palm Beach. One of the last listings brought us to Weston, Connecticut. It had been a month's hard work. We found her estate, and then came the greatest disappointment of all. In her declining years, Alice Delamar decided to protect her privacy by retreating inside this plant-shrouded estate. She refused to be interviewed on camera, and we respected her wishes. She did, however, provide us with some intriguing information about her father, Captain Delamar. A man named Decker approached him sometime between 1888 and 1904, possibly in Colorado. He asked for a $500 loan. Delamar, it is reported, was a tough, canny businessman who had come to the New World and literally made a fortune in various financial dealings and mining interests. Delamar demanded collateral, and Decker offered Stock Certificate 390, which Delamar accepted. Apparently, Decker never repaid the loan, and by default, Delamar became its owner. Through some financial connection of Delamar's, the certificate found its way to Wells Fargo Bank, where it lay undiscovered for nearly 80 years. There is one ironic twist to our story. Some probate attorneys believe that if Decker's heirs could be found, and if they repaid the $500 loan plus interest, they may be able to claim the certificate. If so, who was Decker, and who might his heirs be? In 90 years, the certificate must have passed through many hands. In places stretching from New York to Colorado to possibly Idaho. That it was discovered is perhaps the biggest surprise of all. Since the stock certificate was sold in New York, it is perhaps a safe assumption that Decker purchased it there, but never bothered to file the proper certificate of transfer indicating Blake Brothers no longer owned 390. Meanwhile, the opening up of the lands west of the Mississippi had begun a whole new age in American culture. It was a time in a young country's history when a man, any man, if he was smart and lucky enough, could make his fortune. Gold had been discovered in 1848. The migration west became a violent, surging river of men intent upon making their fortunes.
Decker could have been like any one of these men. Perhaps young, green, but ready to take a chance on striking it big. Perhaps it was in Colorado or Delamar, Idaho itself, where Decker parlayed his Texas Pacific Land Trust Certificate 390 for a $500 loan that was to be his stake. Was it? We don't know.
We are sure that in San Francisco lies $3.2 million unclaimed dollars. Any one of the 59 Deckers of New York or the 160 Deckers of Idaho or Colorado might be able to claim the fortune of a lifetime. Should it be proven that Delamar is the legal owner of the certificate, there still remains some question as to who will receive the money. He had provided in his will that if Alice dies childless, her money, plus any other monies associated with his estate, be given to 3 medical schools for dietary research. Alice never married and never had any children. It is entirely possible that her money, plus that of Certificate 390, will eventually be used to benefit everyone.
Lost civilizations, extraterrestrials, myths and monsters, missing persons, magic and witchcraft.
unexplained phenomena. In Search of Cameras are traveling the world, seeking out these great mysteries. This program was the result of the work of scientists, researchers, and a group of highly skilled technicians. December 1978, a Melbourne, Australia television news crew filmed an object they claimed was a UFO. That film gave chilling credibility to an earlier report of an Australian pilot who disappeared after he radioed that he was being strafed by a UFO.
Delta Sierra Juliet, affirmative. It's not an aircraft, it's...
Are there UFOs in the skies over Australia and New Zealand?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
In the last 30 years, there have been more than 110,000 recorded UFO sightings. Researchers estimate that that number reflects only a tenth of those actually seen. Eyewitnesses claim that in nearly all cases, the UFOs have a saucer-like shape. Despite repeated official government denials that UFOs exist, some people point to hard evidence of scorched areas on the Earth's surface where UFOs have supposedly landed. Believers claim that the scarred areas are caused by intense heat generated by the UFOs. UFO sightings occur throughout the world, but the great majority of reports have been in the southern hemisphere, in the skies over New Zealand and Australia. It was here that the most astounding UFO footage in history was recorded. On December 21st, 1978, radar bowls near Wellington, New Zealand picked up what air traffic controllers called an unexplained blip. A local pilot, Vern Powell, was at the same time bound on a cargo mission from the South Island to the North Island of New Zealand. Powell described the object as anything but plane-like in nature. What was it that Captain Powell, a 35-year flying veteran, saw in that December night sky? Douglas Mabin heads New Zealand's Mount John Observatory.
Well, at that time that was taken, there were two very bright objects in the sky. One early in the morning was the planet Venus, seen in the mornings fairly close to the horizon. And during the night, from a little bit before midnight through to morning, the planet Jupiter was up in the sky, and it was very bright, though not as bright as Venus. So depending on the time of day or night when the photograph was taken, it could have been one of those two planets. People have been able to give us a fair enough description of the time and the position in the sky. They see these things, we're able to work it out, and every report I've had, we've had that sort of description, we've been able to identify it. The reports of these have been going on for so many years now, and if there's such an intelligent set of people about coming from outside the Earth that have been coming around all these times, I think by now they would have landed and introduced themselves.
Others weren't so sure. Quentin Fogarty, a reporter for an Australian television station, was in New Zealand at the time of Vern Powell's flight. His station requested him to do a story on Powell's experiences. Together with David Crockett, a New Zealand cameraman, Fogarty decided to retrace the flight path of Captain Powell. In Search Of has recreated what happened to Fogarty on that fateful flight. Fogarty planned to make the 400-mile round trip between Wellington and Christchurch in a massive Argosy aircraft, which was already scheduled for a freight run. Armed with cameras and sound equipment, the two men hoped to film proof of what Powell had reported. Fogarty realized that the chances of seeing what Powell saw 10 days earlier were remote, but he still had strange feelings about the flight.
There were stages there where I was very, very frightened. And when I thought, well, if I was to die, or if in fact I was to be removed from that aircraft in some shape or form, then it wasn't going to be a painful process. And I can't really explain why I felt that. It's just a feeling I had.
The flight was long. Captain Bill Startup warily scanned the night sky. Fogarty and cameraman Crockett waited in the hold.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Just checking the intercom.
It may be a long night.
Suddenly, Captain Startup spotted the object and called to Fogarty.
Quick, off to starboard.
The object seemed to be hovering around the aircraft.
Do you see it?
Unable to get good camera position, Fogarty and Crockett raced up to the cockpit. This is the film they shot.
And by the time David and myself got onto the flight deck, I could see two bright lights, and in retrospect it now appears that this object was quite low, and in fact was reflecting on the water. We just kept looking at this one bright object that looked like a very bright star outside our starboard window. So we turned towards the object, and at this time David was continuing to film, and at one stage he said to me, he got very excited and turned around to me and said, you know, it's got a brightly lit bottom and a sort of transparent sphere on top. And I was doing a tape commentary at the time, and I remember saying that that sounded like a classic flying saucer shape. And I think it was the last person to see it. Was that I looked out to the right-hand side of the aircraft and peered right down. And this object just went below the aircraft and disappeared. Nobody connected with this case has been prepared to say that they are extraterrestrial, because I don't think you can ever say anything is extraterrestrial until you can actually physically hold on to it or meet with the inhabitants, or, you know, or the thing lands in Central Park and you beam it live television around the world, and then people would say it was hoaxed anyway. But there are a number of possibilities, and I think that probably the strongest of all the possibilities is that it is extraterrestrial.
The film is unlike any other recorded in history. The object darted about, changed color, shimmered with an eerie translucency. The object was incredibly bright, far brighter than any planet or star. The film, shot by Fogarty and Crockett, has since been analyzed by U.S. and Australian scientists. Their conclusions have been that it does show some metallic object, unearthly in its brightness. No one will hazard a guess as to what it was or why it appeared where it did. By plotting where UFOs have reportedly appeared, a complicated grid system was devised by a man who has become the dean of UFO researchers. Bruce Cathy, a commercial pilot for more than 40 years, believes that his system, controlled by the elements of light, energy, and matter, validates the presence of UFOs.
Square one. I only found the system by actually studying UFOs, or the movement of UFOs. And it was after I found that UFOs have to use that system or tuned into that system if they're going to move from point to point in space. The UFO shots were taken in New Zealand around last Christmas. Everything points to the fact that they were definitely, it was hardware in the sky. And the main reason I say this is the fact that it's not the first time. It was a bit of a joke to us at the time when there was such a furor made about this publicly worldwide, as if it was one case. Well, it's not so. There's been many, many cases similar to this in New Zealand and in the same area. There's been material tracked around the Cook Strait area and up around that area on many occasions by radar in Wellington. And on many occasions, even in daylight, there's been an object seen in the sky by crews in an aircraft, and that's also been sighted on radar. And in one of those particular cases, the radar crew asked the crew of the aircraft to vector themselves onto this object so that they could get a closer look at it. The crew were watching this from a distance, and they refused. And that object was in that area for so long that even on the second trip back from Wellington across the Straits again, it was still there. The crew saw it a second time. But that was a broad daylight case. So in no way could they say there was lights at night being reflected or a Venus or anything like this. This is, but as I say, there have been many cases like this, and particularly in that area.
This UFO film shot over New Zealand might bear a strange relationship to an event which occurred 3 months earlier. In Search Of examines that event next. October 21st, 1978. 20-year-old Frederick Valentick took off to fly 120 miles from Melbourne, Australia, across the Bass Strait to King Island. Valentick was scheduled to pick up some fish for a small market that employed him. Despite his youth, he was experienced enough to be a flight instructor, and Frederick Valentick had flown this route many times before.
Delta Sierra Juliet, pilot to ground. Is there any known aircraft in my vicinity below 5,000 feet?
Delta Sierra Juliet. Negative, no known traffic.
Delta Sierra Juliet. There seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000 feet.
Delta Sierra Juliet. What type of aircraft?
I cannot confirm, but it's 4 bright lights that appear to be landing lights. Unknown aircraft has just passed over me, about 1,000 feet.
Is large aircraft confirmed?
Delta Sierra Juliet, affirmative at the speed it's traveling. Are there any RAAF aircraft in the vicinity?
Negative.
Confirm you can't identify aircraft.
Affirmative.
Delta Sierra Juliet, Melbourne. It's approaching from due east of me. It seems to be playing some sort of game, flying at a speed I can't estimate.
Stephen Roby, air traffic controller on duty then, explains the reported UFO's movement.
Several times, and coming from various directions. And then he started orbiting, and the aircraft was orbiting above him. And on several occasions, he sort of stated that towards the end it wasn't an aircraft. And he described it as having a sort of a green light on it, and also it appeared to be a sort of a silver metallic colour.
Delta Sierra Juliet.
What is your altitude?
Delta Sierra Juliet, 4,500 feet.
Delta Sierra Juliet. Confirm you can't identify aircraft.
Affirmative. It's not an aircraft, it's...
Guido Valentick is Frederick's father.
Night. He's supposed to join us with friends where we went for some movie, family movie projection. And that night he never turned up, he didn't ring up. Normally he's always, when he goes for a trip, when he returned at the airport, he normally would have called us, you know, I'll be home after an hour or so. But that night, it was quite strange, you know. We didn't know anything about it. We got home about 11 o'clock and he wasn't home. My wife then started to worry about it. And so, you know, I said, oh, this is too late to start inquiry.
Can you describe it?
Delta Sierra Juliet. It's flying past. It is a long shape. Cannot identify more than that. Coming for me right now.
And he described it as being of a long shape, and as I said before, a silver colour with the various lights on it. And he actually did say it wasn't an aircraft. So it's very strange.
It appears to be stationary. I'm orbiting. The thing, it's orbiting on top of me. There's a green light and a sort of metallic light on the outside. It seems to have vanished now.
Confirm it has vanished.
Affirmative. Do you know what sort of aircraft I've got? Is it military?
No military traffic in this area.
It was 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning. Nothing still happening. And couldn't see any sign of him, and I was just about to get up and maybe get on the phone, where all of a sudden a couple of uniformed blue slack-legged walk in the front door, and at that time we realized immediately that something was wrong.
Delta Sierra Juliet, engine is rough idling and coughing.
Delta Sierra Juliet, what are your intentions?
Proceeding King Island. Delta Sierra Juliet, unknown aircraft now hovering on top of me.
Finally, we lost contact with him in a very strange way. The communications he was putting out seemed to break. People describe it as a sort of a metallic sound, the last transmission that was sent from Delta Sierra Juliet.
Delta Sierra Juliet. Acknowledge.
Do you read me? Do you read me? Delta Sierra Juliet. Repeat. Do you read me?
Despite an extensive 4-day search, which included using a sophisticated Orion aircraft capable of detecting any sort of debris at great ocean depths, not a single scrap of wreckage was ever found. No hard evidence ever turned up that would explain the disappearance of Frederick Valentick. But theories abound. Some say that Valentick became disoriented and saw this lighthouse. A second theory is that he saw lights of fishing vessels and then, becoming disoriented, spiraled his plane into the ocean. Guido Valentick, Frederick's father, believes otherwise.
Well, after Frederick reported this UFO incident, I inclined to think that it could be some intelligent life in the outer space, despite all the officials are trying to suppress this, really makes me very confused, because knowing Frederick what he radiated and knowing my son wouldn't make himself so ridiculous in stating things like that. So I'm inclined to believe that really must be something in the space that the general population may not aware to be. And I realized after his disappearance, which I couldn't have the opportunity before, how many calls I get from various parts of the world. And they really encouraged me to believe that he could be still alive, maybe with another intelligence in the space.
I
One of the most bizarre attempts to prove Valentic still lives is conducted by New Zealand psychic Colin Amory. He claims that through the power of a seance, he can contact Valentic and speak in his voice.
The people I spoke of before, I know that my family are very sad, but it is not necessary. Death is something that is quite painless and is not difficult to bear.
Valentic's plane and the supposed UFO were beyond the reach of radar, thus making it impossible to confirm his report. And the taped conversation between Valentic and the air traffic controller has never been released. The Australian Civil Aviation Department has refused all requests to hear that tape. The department will not give any reason for its refusal.
Delta Sierra Juliet. Acknowledge. Do you read me? Repeat. Do you read me?
There have been hundreds of planes that have disappeared without a trace. Valentic's disappearance is the single documented case where a plane has vanished after claiming contact with a UFO. For years, In Search of cameras have found and recorded the reports of individuals claiming to have seen UFOs.
And there was this weird object, funny noises, and it was really bright.
When I first saw it, I was standing approximately right here, but I couldn't get too good of a view of it because the brush and the trees were in the way.
I don't know how many people saw it and told us the next day that they saw this thing up in the sky. In the sky.
I noticed up by the blue shed over there that there was something in the sky. It was definitely right there.
On the night of November 2nd, 1975, I was sitting here doing my homework, and I looked out the window, and right above the blue building, I saw a UFO come down out of the sky.
All of these first-hand accounts, together with the strange occurrences in the southern hemisphere, only makes one wonder what really does exist in outer space.